Great. So this evening I'm speaking about a topic that I find fascinating and that I love teaching about and researching, although it is quite depressing, I'll admit. So looting has occurred for millennia, dating back to pre-recorded history. Ancient art bears proof of this vandalism, providing us with knowledge that ancient civilizations used destruction to exert power and symbolically destroy enemies. The first example I'll show you is a piece of Assyrian art that features carvings of kings and rulers without facial features. And it's a little hard to see from back there, but the king who's sitting on the throne, his face has been scratched out. And this was a common occurrence in ancient art, that once new rulers, subsequent rulers, had taken over, they would destroy and deface art of prior leaders. From the razing of Persepolis by Alexander the Great, something that he had regretted shortly afterwards, to the looting of Sicily by a Roman governor, cultural plunder has occurred over the centuries. Today's region of upheaval in the Middle East has endured many destructive periods. One of the earliest known destructions of an entire city occurred in Ebla in modern-day Syria. In ancient Rome, art memorialized and even celebrated plunder, as can be seen from the carvings on the Arch of Titus. As you see on the right-hand photo, there is an image of Roman soldiers carrying off a menorah. This was the booty from a battle in ancient Jerusalem. But perhaps Rome's greatest monument to looting is the towering Trajan's column, which pays homage to the woeful destruction of a former nation, the nation of Dacia. The massive monument celebrated Emperor Trajan's 2nd century defeat of the Trajan army and the nation's incorporation into the Roman Empire. In fact, the defeat was so brutal that Rome wiped Dacia off the map. And the treasures recovered from the defeat were enormous. The metal loot was so great that silver and gold lost part of their values. The treasures eliminated all public taxes and debt and funded 123 days of spectacular, free gladiatorial events for Roman citizens. It even funded Roman monuments, such as Trajan's column. Ironically, this project, which was funded by Dacian loot, was a column that memorialized its defeat, and it was a piece of propaganda for the Roman Empire. And I included some images of the column to give you an idea of the images that it presents. The column originally was in color, so at a time when the vast majority of the population wasn't literate, they could read about these battles and the victories of the Romans by reading the images. So it's kind of like a comic strip. So they are once colorful images, and it portrayed the emperor dozens of times. And in those images, I'll show you a few images before going back, you could see the Romans destroying the Dacians, and at the same time, there were images of the emperor that offered the Dacians peace. So it's a propaganda piece. Rather than just showing this as destruction, the monument also presented the emperor as someone who's merciful and actually incorporated the Dacians peacefully into the empire, although we know that wasn't true. The Dacians were killed and their treasures were looted. So again, here are some more images of the column. One of the first legal cases involving the protection of cultural property occurred in Sicily. The philosopher, politician, lawyer, and orator Cicero famously made a series of speeches in 70 BC during the trial of Gaius Verus, the former governor of Sicily. The trial was for laying claim to cultural objects plundered while he ruled Sicily. Amongst other things, Verus sacked prosperous towns for their art and stripped the principal temple of Syracuse. During the course of trial, Verus pled no contest and went into voluntary exile in Marseille. More recently, other leaders laid claim to art and heritage. Napoleon attempted to create a new Rome in Paris. Some say that Napoleon was even the idol, the model of Hitler in regards to art theft. He established the first official military division for seizing and shipping captured artworks. Called the Commission of Arts and Sciences, it consisted of trained personnel who would follow behind the French army to inventory, pack, and ship art back to Paris. One of the major art objects that Napoleon seized were the 4 horses of San Marco, once admired by Petrarch and still a symbol of Venice today. Ironically, the horses were originally displayed at the Hippodrome of Constantinople in modern-day Istanbul. And then they were looted by the Venetians in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. They were displayed in Venice for over half a millennium before they were removed by Napoleon and brought back to Paris. They were returned to Venice finally in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat, and they have never returned to current-day Istanbul. Due to conservation efforts, the original statues are now housed in the Basilica of San Marco, and copies grace the outdoor terraces. However, art and cultural heritage crimes are not a thing of centuries past. The past 100 years has laid witness to shocking crimes. There was wide-scale destruction during the Second World War, from obliteration of Polish cities to the firebombing of German cities, the loss of pre-Renaissance frescoes, the destruction of the oldest Benedictine monastery in the world, located in Italy, south of Rome, and the theft of thousands of objects from civilians and museums. The theft and looting that occurred under the Nazi regime stands apart in its severity. It's still difficult to comprehend its extent and brutality. It's estimated that about 20% of all art in Europe was looted by the Nazis. In addition to art, the Nazis also looted gold, silver, currency, musical instruments, religious items, furniture, books, ceramics, household items, photos, and countless personal effects. Much of the art stolen by the Nazis was destroyed or lost. The Nazis justified their thefts in many ways. And these are common justifications for the appropriation of art. One of the reasons given by leaders is that this appropriation benefits the possessing nation and people. So there was a benefit to Nazi Germany to capture people's art, to keep that art and have it for the Third Reich. Another reason they give is this moral or intellectual superiority. Somehow, the Nazis, the Germans, can appreciate the works more than others, so they were entitled to the works. They deserve to have the works. Another reason given by many leaders who appropriate art is altruism. This idea that they can care for the works better than others, which, as we'll see, isn't necessarily true. If you read about how the Nazis treated art as they were making their retreats and they realized that they saw the writing on the wall and they realized that the art was going to be captured, they actually commanded some of their soldiers to destroy the art. They'd rather that no one had it than their enemies. And the final reason given for appropriation is that somehow the rightful owners don't deserve the works. They're not entitled to enjoy those works. During the Nazi regime, Hitler pushed forward his agenda for art. Hitler himself was a failed artist, and when he came to power, he tried to impose his ideals on the art world. He used art as a weapon, a way to degrade people, a way to legitimize the expansion of the Third Reich, and used art as a propaganda tool. The Nazis used art as a way to display their power, to degrade demographic groups, to raise funds for a growing force, and to propagate their ideology. Cultural vandalism is a very powerful tool because it instills fear. As destruction degrades enemies and suppresses opposition, the objects become symbols of the way in which the degraded group can and will be destroyed. The objects come to symbolize the irrelevance of the past or the weakness of an enemy. Displays of destruction are powerful images that reverberate in society's collective consciousness. Moreover, destruction is a means of punishment and a way to eradicate the past. Hitler tried to obliterate so-called degenerate art and replace it with Germanic works. The works deemed to be degenerate included modern, unfinished, or abstract works because Hitler believed that they somehow insulted the German feeling. These works included paintings by Matisse, Picasso, Klimt, and other countless talented artists. In 1937, the Nazis began ransacking public collections for anything modernist to be displayed as degenerate, to be displayed or sold abroad, to raise funds for the Nazi Party, and ultimately to be destroyed. Reich Minister of Propaganda in Nazi Germany issued a decree authorizing a commission to raid museums to select works for an exhibition of degenerate art. 19,500 degenerate works were confiscated from museums and gathered for the Degenerate Art exhibition, opened in Munich. The works were displayed without proper curatorial process, and some were even partially covered by pejorative statements. Ironically, it was the most successful modern art exhibition of all time. And here's a photo of people standing outside in lines in the rain to get into the exhibition. Afterwards, the exhibition traveled from Munich and throughout Germany. At the completion of its route, some objects were auctioned or sold to raise funds for the Nazi Party, but thousands were destroyed in public bonfires, once again another way to promote their propaganda. For a fascinating look into the pillage of Europe during World War II, I recommend a wonderful documentary called The Rape of Europa. And for those who want more of a Hollywood perspective, there is the Monuments Men film, the George Clooney film that came out 2 years ago. It's based upon a true story, although it's not all accurate. However, if you're interested in learning about these men and women who helped to save art during World War II, I would recommend the book by the same title. It's by Robert Edsel. It's called The Monuments Men, and here are a couple photos of the actual Monuments Men. And they were tasked with going into Europe to protect sites and to protect art, and then after the conclusion of the war, to help in the restitution process, to return objects to rightful owners. Sadly, the 21st century has also been affected by cultural destruction. In 2001, the Taliban shocked the world by wiping out the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. The giant 6th century statues had survived for centuries of war and attack, but they were destroyed by dynamite in 2001 for being idols. The Taliban claimed that their motives were not political, but purely religious. In April 2003, the world was shocked to learn of the raiding of the National Museum in Iraq, perhaps the most important depository of art from ancient Sumerian civilization and other periods of Mesopotamian history. After fighting broke out on the museum grounds in April of 2003, employees left the building. According to local authorities, the museum was plundered for about 48 hours. Initially, it was estimated that 170,000 of the 500,000 exhibits were lost. However, luckily, that was an overestimate. It's now believed that only 15,000 pieces were lost or were destroyed. Included amongst these objects are the alabaster Uruk vase depicting the goddess Inanna on the left-hand side, dates from 3200 BC. And on the right-hand side is the marble mask known as the Sumerian Mona Lisa, or the Lady of Warka. Both objects still missing and extremely valuable. Although tragic in its scale, one inspiring story did emerge from the destruction of the museum. When U.S. forces began a large-scale investigation into the looting, and when they began the recovery mission, they offered amnesty to Iraqi people who would return cultural artifacts. The process resulted in the return of nearly 2,000 items. Some locals claim to have taken the objects from the museum merely for safekeeping, out of fear that these pieces would be destroyed or sold on the international art market. And they willingly gave these objects up and returned them to U.S. forces to be placed safely back in museums or in storage. These actions demonstrate the value that locals have for their heritage, even in times of conflict. Unfortunately, though, thousands of objects from that museum are still missing, and many are believed to have entered private collections abroad. Destructive acts, unfortunately, are still occurring around the world today in places like Syria. And with the use of social media, destruction has been more widely observed and knowledge of its occurrence has spread globally, allowing terrorist organizations to create global fear within an instant. There have been attempts made by other ruling parties to annihilate the past, but the media, the use of the media to publicize atrocities sets these crimes apart. During the conflict in Syria, the UNESCO site Croix de Chevalier was used as a fortress, during which time it suffered damage during an offensive. The site of the fortress was first occupied by the Kurds in the 11th century, and then it was occupied and turned into a fortress by the Crusaders in the 12th century. Countless sites in Syria have been destroyed, including the 11th century Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo. By searching the internet, you can find hundreds of heartbreaking photos of destruction occurring during the war there. And you can see on the photo on the screen, the left-hand side, you can see the minaret, and the right-hand side, it's been demolished, and actually the act of destruction was also captured live on the news. In early 2015, ISIS obliterated the remains of Hatra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Iraq. The city actually was a symbol of multiculturalism, with a blend of Roman, Hellenistic, and Arabic architecture. This is an image of the city beforehand in more peaceful times, and you can see sheep grazing. Here's a close-up of some of the statuary that was in the city. And to see the extent of the city, you can see how large the site was and some of the elements that the city had incorporated. But prior to blowing up the city, ISIS exploited the propaganda effect of showing the actual smashing of statues before blowing up the entire site. So you can see on the picture above a head that was part of the statuary on one of the fortress walls, and then below the photo taken of an ISIS member smashing it with a sledgehammer. And finally, after those effects were exploited, they blew up the site. Shortly after, in the winter of 2015, the world watched in horror as ISIS distributed a dramatic video of destruction of ancient works in the Mosul Museum. And I'm going to show you that short video now. Sorry. What? I think they did. Okay, so I think we had enough. We had enough of that video. It continues along that way. So you had asked who had put in the music. I believe it was ISIS. These are part of their propaganda videos, and they use these videos. They use these videos actually as recruiting videos, and when they release them, recruitment jumps up. So these are actually effective, although disturbing to us. To the target audience of militants, they're effective videos, and they're effective propaganda tools for recruitment. It is a very upsetting video to watch. I remember when it was announced, and basically all my network of art lawyers and heritage specialists, we were circulating the video, but there's one bit of good news. Authorities have confirmed that a lot of the objects that are seen being destroyed are actually copies. Before ISIS entered the area, generally museum authorities will take preemptive measures to store some of the objects and hide them and put them in safekeeping. So although there was destruction, not all of it was actual, not all these objects were actual antiquities. A lot of them were copies. That doesn't mean there hasn't been an incredible amount of loss. So following the release of this video, in the summer, so this video was released in the winter of 2015. In the summer of 2015, it was announced that ISIS militants had entered the city of Palmyra. And Palmyra is famous for having a significant amount of incredibly important architecture. So the structures in Palmyra are known, well, the city itself is known as a site of outstanding universal value, according to UNESCO. It's a crossroads of civilization where East met West. When the site was uncovered in the 17th and 18th centuries, it helped to spark the revival of classical archaeology in the West. Due to its history, Palmyra was archaeologically and historically rich, with temples, an aqueduct, a theater, and colonnaded streets. ISIS entered the city last year, used it as its base, and of course destroyed many of the structures there. Possibly the most heartbreaking was the destruction of the Temple of Bel, a structure recognized as an architectural treasure as significant as the Parthenon in Athens and the Pantheon in Rome. The destruction of sites within the Pearl of the Desert hit the archaeological community heavily. So this was the Temple of Bel before ISIS got to it, and this is it afterwards. So almost complete destruction. Excuse me?
I guess that wasn't a fake.
That was not a fake. That was not a fake, and there's a lot of discussion about whether it should be rebuilt, and there's just a lot of debate about whether these sites should be rebuilt. And that's one of the difficult things. Actually, you bring up a good point, that it's not really movable, whereas individual objects in museums can be moved and put into storage. Sites are more difficult to protect. Although there are some efforts being made to protect some site-specific works, and I'll tell you about one instance in which individuals actually were successful in protecting a site. So through the destruction of these important sites, ISIS attempts to rewrite history by simply destroying the past. The acts of destruction are symbolic, as ISIS forcefully tries to convince the world of its legitimacy as a powerful caliphate requiring conversion or death. When you see these images, though, and read the news, it's important to remember that the destruction of the heritage is not just obliteration of Syrian heritage, but of our shared heritage, as Syria has always been a significant crossroads for human civilization. The West African nation of Timbuktu has also been targeted for its cultural richness. Islamic rebels destroyed Timbuktu's storied 16th century mausoleums due to religious reasons. The rebels also destroyed valuable 15th and 16th century manuscripts. Last month, the Malian Islamic extremist Ahmad al-Mahdi pleaded guilty to the destruction of cultural heritage in Timbuktu in the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague. This is the first time that the ICC has attempted to prosecute the destruction of heritage as a war crime. Until now, destruction of culture was seen as a low-risk crime without any penalty. But now we see it being treated as a more serious crime that will be prosecuted. Al-Mahdi faces a 30-year prison sentence. And his quote when he was before the court, he said that he hoped that my time in prison would be a source of purging the evil spirits that have taken over me. We'll see if the prosecution actually does anything to deter future destruction. In Egypt, the plunder of objects during political turmoil has been well documented. Since the uprisings in 2011, over $6 billion worth of antiquities have been smuggled out of the country. And there has been an irretrievable loss of destruction and cultural information. In another uplifting story, though, locals in Cairo were successful in warding off looters during a demonstration by creating a human chain around the museum to prevent vandals from entering the museum and destroying the objects inside. So once again, we have a story of locals taking action to protect their heritage. So governments and leaders make a lot of justifications for the appropriation of cultural objects, and I discussed some of them earlier in reference to the Nazis. Similarly, governments also justify the destruction of objects. And we see organizations like ISIS, like the Nazis, use some of these justifications. Religious beliefs. One of the justifications that's really hard to argue against is this weighing of human life versus objects. Of course, it's important to protect human lives, and a human life is more valuable than stones and objects, just cultural pieces. So often these objects are destroyed as a casualty of war to protect civilians. There are also political motivations. What the Nazis said was they were trying to move forward Aryanization. Same thing with ISIS. What they're saying is that they're smashing idols, destroying the past, and destroying something that isn't close to God. They create fear, they degrade their opposition, they punish, they use this destruction as propaganda, and they try to legitimize their new leadership. In addition to cultural and religious cleansing, militants are obliterating the memory and identity of populations across the Middle East. It's psychological warfare. They cause fear, they indicate the might of ISIS, warning citizens as to the extent of their violence. Even against international condemnation, ISIS continues its destructive campaign. In fact, individuals protecting cultural heritage have been targeted. Like the Monuments Men, local Syrians have risked their lives to protect their rich heritage by hiding valuable objects from ISIS and protecting monuments and fragile works from air raids and bombings. See, these are images from the Ma'ar Museum in Syria. And you can see on the top left-hand corner an image of a mosaic that's in the museum. And this is a very significant repository for mosaics in the Middle East. So incredible art, some art that just couldn't be moved. So they couldn't move it, as these mosaics were actually attached to walls and attached to structures. So instead they protected these mosaics. So you'll see in the photo on the bottom right-hand side, people putting like some protective barriers against the mosaics. And again, in the next photo, they're protecting them, putting barriers over top. And their faces, when this was reported in the media, their faces were blocked out because individuals doing this and protecting art are actually targets of ISIS. ISIS is against this. Their goal is to destroy art. So if you work against them by protecting art, you're going to be a target. So they've risked their lives to save this art. At the end, they use sandbags to protect the art against raids. And this is actually what we saw during World War II. That's what Italians had done to protect the Last Supper. And that really is the only reason that the Last Supper did survive bombings in Milan during the Second World War. So those same methods were used in Syria to protect mosaics. And they were successful. There was some destruction, and you can see on the right-hand side one of the statues that was destroyed during an air raid, but overall they were able to save a lot of the mosaics that were in the museum. But in addition to those individuals saving the art, there have been others that have been targeted for trying to protect cultural heritage. The world mourned the loss of one of Palmyra's greatest champions, Palmyra's antiquities chief, Dr. Khaled al-Asaad. ISIS beheaded the 82-year-old antiquities scholar and labeled him as an infidel. They hung his body on a column in the main square of historic Palmyra. The symbolism invoked in hanging him from the spot where he devoted his life was not lost on anyone. He has been internationally recognized as a martyr for humanity. And last year when I was in Boston, I went up to the Museum of Fine Arts, and they actually had a display honoring him. There's a small memorial next to an area where there's Syrian art displayed. So he has become a symbol for cultural heritage and preservation and protection. After witnessing destruction by the hands of terrorist groups, some people feel that it's appropriate to buy loot, to bring these objects out of the Middle East. But that's actually wrong. There's no doubt that looted antiquities are a source of revenue for ISIS, and thus looting must be stopped. As a recent headline in the Wall Street Journal claimed, looted art helps fund jihadists in Europe. Western collectors today are creating, or at least increasing, a market for looted antiquities by creating situations that lead to the pillage of ancient sites and in turn increase violent terrorist activity. The trade in illicit artifacts fuels demand for the goods. Objects are placed on the market because they have a value. Western buyers purchase antiquities at depressed prices after they've passed from hand to hand of looters, smugglers, middlemen, creating greater incentive to loot and smuggle. Compared with other forms of trafficking, the antiquities trade is particularly attractive as it carries a low risk of detection with potential for high profits. And that makes sense. If you're trying to smuggle an object into the country, it's hard to smuggle weapons, drugs, high amounts of currency, but smuggling in an antiquity, even in some cases coins, valuable ancient coins, it's easier to get that through customs than other illegal objects. Given the millions of archaeological sites across the Middle East and North Africa, the supply of ancient artifacts is virtually limitless. Until the conflicts in Asia and Syria end, little can be done to fight this illicit trade from the supply side. So it's important to stop it from the demand side of the equation. And to show you, just to give you an image of looting, this is an aerial image of a city in Syria. I think this was either near Palmyra or Aleppo. I can't remember off the top of my head. This was the site, an aerial photo before the looting and after. So those are all looters' pits. Not archaeologists, but rather locals who are going in and just digging under the ground. So just for comparison's sake, it is quite dramatic, I think, the before and the after. Because looting is obviously so robust now, there's been a vast increase in the supply of antiquities from Syria and Iraq entering through U.S. customs within the past 5 years. U.S. agents suggest that the revenue from antiquities has increased during the past few years. Some buyers don't realize that their purchases are loot. They really just don't know. Those that do know mistakenly justify their actions, believing that they're saving objects from war zones. However, this reasoning is wrong. They're mistaken because removing objects without proper archaeological process actually contributes nothing to the historic record or to the public, but in fact, it just encourages the illicit trade of antiquities. For this reason, I advocate educating the public about these issues. Terror groups profit from looting, and looting is rampant. ISIS does not have the funding of other militant groups like al-Qaeda. They don't have natural resources like oil. So instead, they rely on antiquities to raise funds. ISIS even has its own laws that regulate black market profits. The ISIS regulating agency is based in Syria, and it provides permits to civilian looters, non-ISIS members, and charges them a tax of 20% to 50% of their profits. So even if you're not purchasing objects from ISIS directly, and it's instead being bought, these objects are bought by civilians, part of those profits are still going to ISIS. You cannot leave ISIS territory without proving that you've paid that tax for the objects that are leaving from within its bounds. So buying from locals also is problematic. The FBI issued a warning that loot is on the market and in Europe, and that buyers should be very concerned about this. These works enter commerce surreptitiously, often sold online via phone or video chat, with items even appearing on eBay. One way to avoid destruction and looting is to only purchase works that do not contribute to the demand for blood antiquities. Collectors and dealers should apply due diligence. This is some of the work that I do. I work in an area of, I'm an attorney, so I work with collectors in researching works before they purchase. So purchasers first should buy from reputable sources. They should collectors should confer with either art lawyers or art market professionals to investigate a dealer's reputation, to look into their professional standing, and to see whether they've been in prior lawsuits involving loot or stolen objects. Another step, they should investigate an object's history. We call an object's ownership history its provenance. So see if it's been owned in the past, if it's fresh to the market, if there's dirt on the object still. That work is a little suspicious if it came right out of the ground and there's actually no history to it. Another part of doing due diligence is to procure all the required documentation. This includes export licenses, importation declarations, and certificates from foreign ministries. So before an object, an antiquity, can leave a nation, you need to have an export license. And when you purchase from a reputable dealer, even abroad, you will receive these types of certificates. In addition, when objects are brought into the US, buyers need to declare the objects through the ICE, through the customs officials, declaring what the objects are and correctly identifying their origin. And finally, certificates from foreign ministries. An example, about 10 years ago, I was in Greece and I bought an ancient coin, and when I purchased the coin, I needed to give a copy of my passport to the dealer, and he provided me with a certificate from the Greek government that stated that he was given permission to sell this object outside of the country to a tourist, to someone that was bringing the object outside of Greece. Another thing to keep in mind is some of these red flags. So something that can be seen as suspicious is if you're purchasing an object and the find spot is from a politically torn nation. So 10 years ago, objects coming out of Syria were not seen as suspicious. They weren't problematic in any way. But if an object had been removed from Syria after 2011, it should come under high scrutiny. It may have been looted during the war. I mean, it's not certain, but it's a red flag. You should be suspicious and continue to delve deeper into the history of an object. Another red flag is that there's no recorded provenance or provenience. The provenience is the find spot. The provenance is the ownership history. So if the object just seemed to come out of the blue, has no history, it's another red flag. You should second guess whether you should purchase that object. Another red flag are government warnings and red lists. And I have a couple of examples here. ICOM, which is the International Council of Museums, they print these red lists to warn buyers about objects that are on the market that are troublesome, either contributing to looting or problematic on resale. So this is an example of one from Libya and one about objects from Iraq. Other things to look at, other red flags, are sales from suspicious sources. So you'd want to purchase from an established art house, an auction house, a gallery, or a dealer. If a gallery just puts up a sign and a month-old gallery that somehow just appears on your online research, be a little suspicious. Look into who those individuals are who are selling you objects. And another part of a suspicious source is, where is it being sold to you? Is someone bringing you into a back room? And not just here in the US, but even when you're traveling abroad. Someone wants to show you an amazing object that no one's seen before, you should be suspicious. Just because you're a tourist and you get caught up in purchasing things, you should still consider these red flags and doing your due diligence. And finally, another red flag that I listed are depressed prices. So if an object normally sells for $50,000 and someone offers it to you for $10,000, that's a little suspicious. Why are you getting this deal? Perhaps there's a problem with the object in some way. Perhaps it was looted or it was stolen. So these are things you should consider. Another thing to consider when you're purchasing antiquities is the value. Even if it doesn't interest you whether or not you're purchasing loot, illicit goods are problematic from an investment perspective. At resale, lower prices are generated for objects without clear ownership histories. A provenance, this ownership history, is considered during the valuation process, and pieces with strong histories typically sell for significantly higher prices. If a work is revealed to be looted, there may be a cloud on its title that vitiates its value and makes the work vulnerable to seizure. Collectors may be unable to display their objects for fear of seizure from US authorities or even foreign governments. And that cloud on the work does not disappear. Collectors who wish to one day donate objects to a museum may face difficulties, as many reputable institutions will not accept works without clear provenance. Without the ability to sell works or dispose of them at will, buyers may be rightfully haunted by their purchases for years to come. So for collectors, the solution is simple. Don't buy antiquities without completing due diligence. If you truly love art and antiquities, do not buy stolen art. So I know it's a little hot in here now. Does anyone have any questions?